Hi everyone, and welcome to this lesson on everything that you need to know about the hazard perception test. Now, the test can be quite tricky because it's not always obvious what exactly you're being tested on. So in this lesson, we'll go over all the basics on how the test works, how you're awarded marks, and then finally, how you can achieve the highest marks in your test. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first question that you might have is, what is the hazard perception test? And the hazard perception test is simply testing your ability to recognise hazards in a variety of different situations. So it was introduced in 2002, and the idea is to ensure that new drivers can correctly identify when hazards begin to develop. And the way in which this is tested is through a series of short video clips. You'll be shown a number of video clips, and then you need to click when you see hazards begin to develop, and in this lesson we'll cover all of how that works. So first of all, how does the test work in practice? So you'll do your multiple choice section of the driving theory test, and then once you've completed that, you'll then go on to do the hazard perception test afterwards, and then at the end of that you'll get a sheet of paper telling you whether you've been successful or not. So in order to pass the driving theory test, you need to pass both sections. So that includes passing both the multiple choice section first, and then also the hazard perception test. Before the hazard perception test, you'll be shown a short video about how the test works. So you'll already be an expert because you've watched this video, but it will just explain how the specific software works at the test centre. You'll then watch the 14 video clips on the same computer that you used to complete the multiple choice section, and these clips have no sound and they last around 1 minute each. And around 2015 the DVSA introduced CGI videos, so all these videos are computer generated now, they're not real life footage. The clips feature everyday examples of driving, and they're filmed from the driver's perspective, and they're filmed in various different conditions and settings. They might be in busy residential areas, on country roads, and then in the day and at night also. And the test itself will take around 20 minutes to complete. So, how do you score points on the hazard perception test? So you'll score points by clicking the mouse when the developing hazards appear. And there's more on that in just a moment on what a developing hazard is. But you'll score points by clicking your mouse when you see a hazard begin to develop. So each clip contains one developing hazard, but one clip will have two, and you won't be told which one this is. So 13 of the 14 clips will have one developing hazard. However, one of the 14 will have two developing hazards in it, and it's your job to spot when they appear. Don't worry too much about trying to decide which is which, because we'll cover in just a moment that if you click and there is no developing hazard, you won't lose points. Red flags at the bottom of the screen will show you if your click's been registered, so the software on the computer will show you when you've clicked your mouse, and you'll be able to see that with a red flag at the bottom of the screen. And you cannot go back and change your answers after the clip is finished. So if you've watched the clip and you've seen the hazards and you've clicked your mouse, you can't go back and change when you would have clicked your mouse on that. You'll then go on to the next clip, and so it's important to get it right first time, because you cannot change your answers. So, what are developing hazards on the hazard perception test? So as I mentioned in that previous slide, developing hazards, what do I mean by that? And to start off with, we'll have a look at a few hazard basics, and then we'll narrow down what they're looking for in the hazard perception test. So a hazard, by definition, is anything that could make you have to change speed or course, and they can either be static or moving. So first of all, static hazards, it's in the name, they don't move, they're static, and they include things such as bends, junctions and road narrowings, and you can often identify when they're coming up because of warning signs and also reduced speed limits as well. On the other hand, moving hazards, again, it's in the name, they move, and they include other road users such as other vehicles, cyclists and pedestrians, and it's this category of hazards, the moving hazards, that we're looking out for in the hazard perception test. So if you're coming up to a bend or a junction, that's not what's scored necessarily, but if there's a vehicle approaching a junction and they pull out on you, then that's what you're looking for in the hazard perception test, and there's more on that in the next few slides. Just a note, it's not too important for the hazard perception test itself, but when dealing with hazards, you need to assess how to deal with the hazard safely and how your actions will affect other road users. So as I said, let's have a look specifically at the hazard perception test and what you're looking at. And highlighted in red, a developing hazard is a moving hazard. So not while the static hazards that we just looked at, it's a moving hazard that would cause you to take action such as changing your speed or course. So that's vitally important to carry on to remember in the rest of this lesson, and also when practicing for the hazard perception test, you're looking for moving hazards that would cause you to take action, and we'll have a look at an example of that in the next few slides. So to start off with, a potential hazard could be a junction. It's a static hazard, it's not moving, but a junction represents a hazard. Obviously you have reduced speed limits, you have warning signs, so they do pose a risk to us. Other road users might have poor visibility, their observations might not be great, and particularly if you're on a motorcycle, they might not be able to see you very clearly, so junctions are a risk. However, they're not moving, so the hazard hasn't begun to develop when we see a junction. However, a vehicle approaching the junction could then pull out on us. They could not see us, they could have poor observations, as I say, and they could then go into the road. So a developing hazard starts when we see that moving vehicle in the hazard perception test, and it becomes an actual hazard when it pulls out and causes us to take the action. So the hazard begins to develop when we see the vehicle enter that frame. So when we see that potential risk as it approaches the junction, there may be clues because the vehicle may be travelling fast, it may be coming up to a junction that has poor visibility, and that might give us a clue that we have to be aware that they may pull out, as shown in this example. So as I said, an example of what that looks like now. So we're in a quiet residential area, we've got some vehicles parked on the side of the road and a lady walking on the left hand side. Now, none of these are potential hazards because they're not affecting us in any way at this time. On the right hand side we have a junction, and as you can see, a vehicle has pulled out on us from that junction. So that vehicle is what the developing hazard is in the hazard perception test. So again, let's look at what we mean by these hazards. So the lady on the left, if she was walking towards the road, then that could be a developing hazard, so we would click for that. But she's not, she's walking along the side. Those vehicles parked up on the side, no one's opening any doors or any movement or anything like that, so they're not posing a risk. On the right hand side we've got the junction, that's not yet a hazard. However, as soon as that vehicle enters the frame, we can see that that's a potential hazard, and it does become an actual hazard, so that's a developing hazard, and that's what we're being scored on in the hazard perception test. So all those static objects, whether it be all the driveways, again, a vehicle could pull out of that, but until there's reverse lights or something like that, then there's no hazards that are developing, so we don't need to click for those. Similarly, the lady walking on the side of the road, she was walking along the path, she wasn't showing any intentions of walking towards the road, and so was not a developing hazard. If, however, she was walking towards the road, and it was questionable, if she walked in between the vehicles, and her observations were not great and we couldn't really see her, and she walked from the path behind while those parked vehicles and into the road, then that's obviously going to catch her eye and we would click because that hazard could develop as she steps into the road. And we'll look at some more examples of that in some more video clips. So how does the scoring system work for the hazard perception test? So you can get up to 5 points for each of the developing hazards. And to score 5 points, you need to click the mouse as soon as you see the hazard begin to develop. So in the previous example, when we saw that vehicle entering the frame from the right hand side towards the junction, we would click then. As soon as it enters the frame, click, we would score 5 points. A little later, and we would score 4 points. A little later than that, 3 points. And as it eventually gets towards the junction and starts to enter towards our path, you would score 3, 2 and 1 points. And too late, you'd score 0 points. Similarly, if you click too early before the scoring window opens, then you won't score any points. And here's a visual representation of how that looks. And each of the scoring windows is equal. So we'll have a look at an example of how a scoring window works in the next example video. So the maximum score that you can score on your hazard perception test is 75. Now there's 14 clips that you watch, and one of them has 2 developing hazards, so there's 15 developing hazards in total. So 5 marks times 15, that gives you a 75. However, the pass mark is 44, so you need to score an average of 3 marks on each of the developing hazards. And so the important thing to take away is that even if you don't get it spot on every single one, that's fine, because you only need to score an average of 3 on each of the developing hazards in order to pass the test. So a few common myths, and then we'll look at some more examples. So you don't lose points by clicking and getting it wrong. For example, if you click and the potential hazard doesn't materialise into a developing hazard, then you don't lose points. So in that previous video example, if that vehicle came up to the junction and then saw us and then came to a stop, but we clicked as it entered the frame, then we don't lose points for that. We only get points, and this is what the test is testing, we only get given points if we click and then it develops into an actual hazard. So if you click and it doesn't materialise, or if you click and you think you see a hazard but it's actually not a hazard that is developing, then you don't lose points for that. You'll score nothing if you try and cheat by clicking in a set pattern or keep clicking, and you'll be told at the end of the clip that you've scored 0 points because of this. So don't try and cheat the system by repeatedly clicking or trying to click in the pattern to try and catch the scoring window. If you click too many times, you'll be scored within the clip that you've scored 0 because you have tried to cheat. And don't worry about clicking when you see potential hazards throughout the clip. You can click many times before you're disqualified. Just click when you see a problem. So if you think you see a hazard, just click. Don't try and second guess how many times you've clicked. Just click when you see the hazards. The videos are designed in such a way that these should be fairly obvious. So don't worry too much about clicking several times on potential hazards that you see throughout the clip. So as I said, we'll look at some more example videos now. So this is looking at how the scoring window works. And the important point in this clip is looking at the cyclist looking over their shoulder, and that would be an example of when the scoring window would start, because they've looked over their shoulder, which is showing their intention to cross the road. So we'll see how the scoring window counts down now. So like I said, from that moment where they look over their shoulder, the scoring window would start, and as you can see, gradually goes down as that developing hazard develops into an actual hazard. So some developing hazards to look out for. So these are common things that come up in the test. So vehicles pulling out from junctions or the side of the road. So we saw an example of that in the first video that we looked at. Emergency vehicles responding to emergencies. Children running between parked cars, and that might apply to pedestrians as well, but particularly children if they're playing beside the road and they're in a residential area near parked cars. Meeting oncoming vehicles on narrow lanes, so you may need to give way to vehicles that are coming towards you and don't stop. Cyclists moving into your path, animals running to the road, and pedestrians stepping out into the road. So when you do some practice tests, look out for some of these, and you should notice that there's a common theme of some of the most common hazards that you'll encounter. And finally, a few top tips for the test. Now, the first one's quite an important one because it's a common gripe that a lot of people have with the hazard perception test, and quite a few instructors as well, in the sense that if you click too early, you might be outside of the scoring window and you would score 0 points. So the recommendation is that you can try what's known as the 2-click method, and that involves clicking a second time around 1 second after your initial click. And this hopefully ensures that you get within the scoring window, because if you click before you start to get scored for that particular clip, for example, if you see a pedestrian way off in the distance and you click, and as you get closer the scoring window then starts, then you would lose out. So the recommendation is that you use this 2-click method. Click a first time when you first think that you see a hazard, and then just to ensure that you're within the scoring window, click a second time around a second later. Another point is that there may be something way off in the distance. So when you first see a potential hazard that you think might develop, click, and then as you get closer and you're sure that the hazard starts to develop fully, then you can click again and then use the 2-click method for that. So every time I would recommend using that 2-click method. Don't get fixated on a single potential hazard. Keep scanning for more potential developing hazards in the clip. So if there's a particular junction or there's a row of parked cars and nothing's happening around them, then don't get fixated on them. Keep scanning the clip, because hazards will come from all directions and potentially in the distance as well, and you don't want to miss out on those because you're fixated on a single potential hazard. And now you know how it all works, do plenty of practice. In the description I will put a number of free resources and also some paid resources, but there's hundreds upon hundreds of practice clips that you can use to help you revise for this test. And the main purpose of this video was to try and teach you how to approach the hazard perception test. It wasn't to walk through the clips like many of the videos do, because I think in some ways it almost gives you the answer. Whereas if you watch this video, you try and understand how it all works and then apply it to some revision questions, then it should make the learning a lot easier for you. So our final clip, again, we're in a residential area. There's lots of parked cars on the side of the road, and the developing hazard in this example is this lady with her dog speaking to her friend that waves goodbye and steps into the road. So we'll analyse this clip and have a look at what I meant by those top tips. So I'll pause the video early on because I've spotted that pedestrian now. So you can see I've circled when I've spotted her, and that's way off in the distance, so the scoring window wouldn't necessarily open that yet. But I'd still click. Now she's shown an intent to walk towards the road because she's turned her body, and as you can see that then develops. So the scoring window would start when she makes that body movement in the test. So as you can see, in the distance I could click now because I've spotted her, I wouldn't score anything. As I get closer, she's waved goodbye, turned her body towards the road, and you can see the scoring window starts to count down from that moment. So my recommendation in a clip like that is click when you first see the pedestrian. You want to then click when you first see that body movement towards the road and that wave goodbye that shows some sort of intent to potentially move out. And then if she hadn't seen me, which she didn't, then she steps into the road. I'd then click a second later after that first click to ensure that I get in the scoring window, and then as you see it developed into an actual hazard. And that concludes this lesson on hazard perception. I hope that clears up all your queries on how the test works and how to get the best score by using the various tricks and tips. If you enjoyed this lesson, then you might enjoy our full 7-day course that includes over 5 hours worth of video and covers absolutely everything that you need to pass your driving theory test. I've popped a link in the description so you can find out more there, and we would love to have you join us. But for now, best of luck with the theory test, and we'll see you in the next lesson.